everyone, welcome back to The Deep Dive. We're all about getting to the heart of complex topics without bogging you down, you know? So today we're diving into something that's kind of everywhere. You see it in, well, how governments operate, or even like why that one coworker always seems to have your back. It's cooperation.
Cooperation.
Yeah.
And to really unpack it, we're going with a classic, Robert Axelrod's The Evolution of Cooperation. This book, it's really fascinating because it looks at why cooperation happens. Even when, being totally selfish seems like the best move.
Right. And it's not all just theory. I mean, Axelrod uses all sorts of examples. International relations, like why countries decide to sign treaties, or how the U.S. Senate, how that whole thing actually works. There's even this surprising cooperation that happened, get this, in the trenches of World War I, and then, cooperation in nature too. So get ready to see things maybe a little differently by the end of this. And for this deep dive, it's Axelrod's book, Front and Center.
Let's get right to the heart of it. Why is cooperation even a question, right? On the surface, it seems obvious. Everyone working together, best outcome for everyone. But here's the thing. As Axelrod points out, if everyone just acts in their own best interest, what they think is best for them, the end result could be worse for everyone.
Okay, I think we need an example here. Something concrete, right? Think about all those debates about trade between countries, tariffs and stuff. It seems pretty clear. Two countries put up huge tariffs on each other's goods, probably hurts both their economies in the long run. Free trade usually creates more wealth overall.
Exactly. But here's the catch. For each country on its own, say one country drops all its trade barriers, wide open, but the other one keeps theirs up. Well, the country that opened up could be flooded with cheaper imports. And that could really damage their own industries. So each country thinks no matter what the other one does, keeping my barriers up is safer. Protects their own economy, right?
So it's like a trap, right? Each country wants to protect itself, keeps those barriers up, and then what? They both end up worse off than if they had just cooperated. Drop the barriers together. It's like everyone's being rational, but then the outcome for everyone is irrational.
Exactly. It's that problem of cooperation that Axelrod really digs into. And to get a grip on this, he uses this model, this sort of abstract laboratory. It's called the prisoner's dilemma.
The prisoner's dilemma, yeah. If you haven't heard of this, here's the quick version. Imagine two people, right? They get arrested for a crime. They're being questioned separately, totally incommunicado. So each one has two choices. Stay silent, so cooperate with the other person, or confess, which is basically defecting.
And here's how it plays out. If they both stay silent, maybe a light sentence, for the literature charge. But if one confesses, rats out the other one, the confessor could go free. And the silent one, they get slammed with a really harsh penalty. Now, if they both confess, they both get a moderate sentence, but it's still worse than if they both kept quiet.
Right. So you're one of these people. What do you do? If the other stays silent, you confess, you walk away free. If the other person confesses, you better confess too, right? Because then at least it's not as bad as if you'd stayed silent. So from each person's perspective, confessing, defecting always seems like the better move, no matter what the other person does.
That's it, the core dilemma. Each person, thinking rationally, chooses to defect. But the ironic thing is, if they'd both cooperated, stayed silent, they both get a way better outcome. And Axelrod, he really emphasizes this. The prisoner's dilemma, it's not just some theoretical game. It's in tons of real-world situations, like individual incentives going against what's best for everyone. Game theory even lays this out with a few inequalities. The temptation to defect, like walking away scot-free, that's the best for an individual. Then there's the reward for both cooperating. Worse than that, you stay silent, other person confesses, you're the sucker. And the worst of all, individually speaking, you both confess. Still better than being the sucker, though. So that structure, temptation higher than the reward, that's key.
Okay, so we've got the problem. Everyone's self-interested. Things can go south for everyone. But the book is called The Evolution of Cooperation. So how does cooperation actually happen in these cutthroat scenarios?
This is where things get interesting. Axelrod did these really cool computer tournaments, invited game theorists, to submit their strategies, basically sets of rules for playing this prisoner's dilemma, not just once, but over and over against each other.
And the surprising part, the simplest strategy called TIT consistently won. Can you explain, how Tit-for-Tat actually works?
Super simple. Starts by cooperating on the very first move. After that, it just mirrors the other player's last move. So other player cooperated. Tit-for-Tat cooperates next round. If the other player defected, Tit-for-Tat defects next round.
It's like, okay, I trust you, but if you try to screw me, I'll do the same back. But if you're nice, I'll be nice too. It's almost like the golden rule, but with clear boundaries.
Exactly. And Axelrod, he analyzed what made strategies do well in these tournaments. Found four key things. Niceness, so never the first to defect. Provocability, meaning they'd retaliate. Forgiveness, so they'd go back to cooperating if the other player did. Yeah. And clarity, their behavior was easy to understand, predictable.
And Tit-for-Tat, it checks all those boxes, right? Starts friendly, retaliates if attacked, forgives, and it's totally predictable.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that the really long, complex strategies, some are like trying to think many steps ahead using fancy math, they didn't do that much better. Sometimes being too clever isn't the best.
Now, these computer tournaments, they're interesting in theory, but how does this work in the real world where you don't have like a computer making perfectly rational decisions? Axelrod looks at how cooperation happens even when there's no one in charge, right?
Absolutely. He uses the U.S. Senate, to illustrate this. You've got all these individuals, each with their own goals, their own agendas, and they want to look good back home to their voters, right? It's not exactly a zero-sum game, though. Senators, they have chances to do things that benefit themselves and others.
And this is where those unwritten rules, those norms of behavior become really important.
Exactly. One of the big ones in the Senate, as Axelrod describes it, is reciprocity. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. It's things like vote trading. I'll support your bill if you support mine. But it goes beyond that. Like all these ways senators help each other out. The understanding is they'll be repaid later. One quote in the book says it all. Reciprocity is a way of life in the Senate.
The book points out that Washington wasn't always like this, right? Early on, it was a lot more ruthless, unreliable. So how did this reciprocity thing actually take hold?
Axelrod argues that it was a gradual thing. Individual senators pursuing their own interests, but they were interacting repeatedly. The key idea here is the shadow of the future. It's how likely it is these senators would continue working with each other. Over the years, as turnover in Congress decreased, those relationships became more likely to continue. So cooperation based on reciprocity became a good, stable strategy for individual senators. You help someone out now, they'll likely help you out later. So thinking long-term in your interactions, it really makes a difference. If you know you'll be dealing with someone again and again, well, it changes how you think about immediate self-interest.
The expectation of continued interaction is key for cooperation. Now, one really surprising example in the book is about cooperation in, you wouldn't believe it, trench warfare in World War I.
Yeah, this is a fascinating case. So the Western Front, static trench warfare, this amazing thing happened. They called it the live and let live system. It just developed between these opposing units, small units. There's this intense hatred, this huge war going on. But soldiers on both sides, they often avoided really hurting each other, as long as the other side did the same.
Hard to believe, right? Sworn enemies, deadly war, and they're finding ways to cooperate.
Exactly. Axelrod, he draws on historical accounts. He argues that those trenches, that static warfare, it created a kind of prisoner's dilemma. But at the level of these small units, facing each other across no man's land, both sides wanted to weaken the enemy, of course. But they realized that attacking each other just led to everyone suffering, with very little strategic gain in that situation. So a bit of restraint on both sides actually became better than the constant violence.
And this wasn't based on any official agreements, right? It just happened on its own, locally.
Exactly. And it happened in some striking ways. They avoided attacks when the other side was handing out rations, there were these unspoken truces during Christmas or bad weather. There was even this tit-for-tat retaliation. If one side attacked, the other side would respond in a similar way. But they usually avoided escalating things.
So tit-for-tat playing out in the trenches. But how did they even communicate these unwritten rules in all that chaos and danger?
Mostly through actions. Both sides made sure to show they could retaliate if they had to. Snipers, for example, might aim for non-lethal spots. Show their accuracy without killing. Artillery might fire a few warning shots instead of a full barrage. That threat of retaliation, that was really important for keeping the cooperation going. And then within the units, the experienced soldiers, they'd teach the new guys the unwritten rules, basically leave them alone and they'll probably leave you alone.
Amazing how that system emerged and kept going despite the war. But the book also talks about how it eventually fell apart in some areas. What happened?
The higher commands, they started ordering these mandatory raids. And that really messed things up. These raids forced the units to break those agreements they'd made with the enemy across from them. And of course, that triggered a need to retaliate, to avenge their comrades. So you see how both cooperation and defection can kind of feed on themselves. Once that cooperation breaks down, it's hard to get it back. It shows how top-down pressure, a lack of local control, can really wreck even well-established cooperation. Something to think about in any hierarchy.
The bigger picture, the rules from above, they matter a lot for whether cooperation can survive on the ground. Now, switching gears here, Axelrod also looks at cooperation in biology, where things like friendship or long-term planning, they don't really exist.
Right. He shows that these basic principles of cooperation, they apply even to organisms that don't think strategically the way we do. Evolution, genetics, survival of the fittest, they can actually favor cooperative behavior based on reciprocity.
Got an example of how that might work in nature.
One interesting one is these certain types of sea bass. They're hermaphrodites, so they have both male and female parts. When they mate, they often form pairs, and they seem to take turns. One time one's the egg layer, which takes more energy, the next time the other one is. And these pairings, they fall apart if the roles aren't pretty fairly divided over time. It's thought that this cooperation might have evolved because of inbreeding, when the species wasn't as common. But even without close kinship, this back-and-forth cooperation, it can become stable over time.
So even without conscious thought, natural selection can favor that Tit-for-Tat strategy.
Exactly. Axelrod also talks about clustering. Imagine mostly defectors, right? But a small group of cooperators, they interact with each other more than with the defectors. That cooperation gives them an advantage within their cluster, so cooperation can get a foothold, even in a population of defectors. He even talks about a ratchet effect in social evolution. Once cooperation is established, it's harder for non-cooperative strategies to take over completely.
The book even touches on some applications in disease and genetic defects. Pretty interesting.
Yeah, there's some thought that, like, the shifts between chronic and acute phases in some diseases, it might be related to how likely the pathogen is to keep interacting with the host, and the chance of Down syndrome increasing with the mother's age. That's tentatively explored as, like, a defection by chromosomes during cell division. Though Axelrod's careful to say these are speculative applications.
It really shows how broadly these ideas of cooperation can apply. Now, for our listeners, what are the practical takeaways here? How can you choose better in your own interactions and help promote cooperation in your life, your communities?
One important thing is to try to avoid constantly comparing your success to others, in a zero-sum way. That kind of thinking can make you envious, which can lead to those defection behaviors we talked about. A better way is to look at your outcomes compared to what's possible, given the other person's strategy. Are you doing as well as you could be, realistically?
That makes sense. If you're just focused on getting more than the other person, you might miss chances for everyone to benefit. What else can you do to encourage cooperation?
That shadow of the future, making it bigger, is key. If your interactions are more long-term, more durable, more frequent, you're more likely to cooperate. Think about building lasting relationships in business, in your personal life. Governments can help too by making laws and penalties that encourage cooperation, discourage defection.
What about altruism? Does genuine selflessness play a big role in cooperation?
True altruism, like really caring about the other person's well-being, it can definitely lead to cooperation. But Axelrod points out that a lot of things that look altruistic, they're actually based on reciprocity. Maybe not obviously. Like you donate to charity, maybe it makes you feel good, or people see you doing it, or you just want a better society overall. So altruism can be a motivator, but reciprocity is often a more stable basis for widespread cooperation.
So teaching and practicing reciprocity is a good way to get more cooperation going. The book really highlights how well that Tit-for-Tat strategy works.
Exactly. Tit for tat. It's not just effective, it's also morally sound. It never starts the defection, and it never scores higher than the other player in any single interaction. It wins by consistently getting others to cooperate. And communities that use reciprocity, they can even police themselves. Because people who try to exploit the system, they'll face consequences. And trying to be too clever, using complex strategies, that can backfire because you seem unpredictable, and that discourages cooperation.
The book also looks at how social structures, even simple labels, can affect cooperation. Seems pretty relevant to some of the divisions we see today.
It is. Axelrod explains how just having observable characteristics, labels, attached to groups, it can shape how we expect them to act, how we interact with them. And this can lead to, like, self-fulfilling prophecies, reinforcing bad stereotypes. So you have two groups, blue and green. People are nice to their own group, mean to the other. That pattern can become stable even if there's no real difference between the groups. The blues see the greens as mean, which confirms their bias, and vice versa. everyone ends up worse off, and often it's the minority groups that suffer the most.
So everyone loses out on potential cooperation, and often those who are already worse off get hit the hardest.
Right. Labels can also reinforce existing hierarchies. Those with more of something valuable, they might exploit those with less, and it's hard for those at the bottom to change things. Interestingly, having a reputation for using tit-for-tat, that's good, but the best reputation, strategically speaking, might be that of a bully. Someone who always takes the most from others, but never lets anyone defect against them. Of course, that strategy can cause a lot of conflict and instability in the long run.
Lastly, Axelrod connects these ideas of cooperation to international relations. Sovereign nations, no central authority, constantly facing prisoners' dilemmas.
Yeah, arms races, treaties, environmental agreements, you can look at them all through this lens. The simple prisoner's dilemma model. It has limits when you apply it to global politics, sure, but it still gives you insights into the dynamics, the challenges of getting stable cooperation in a world without one power in charge. Even things like territoriality, they can affect how strategies spread and become stable in these systems.
So, to sum it all up, what are the key takeaways from this deep dive into the evolution of cooperation?
The big thing is, cooperation isn't just some ideal. It can happen and keep going, even among self-interested people or countries. Mechanisms like reciprocity, the anticipation of future interactions, they make it work. Strategies like Tit-for-Tat, they're amazingly effective in all sorts of situations. Personal relationships, biological systems, even international relations. The key is often starting with cooperation, responding consistently to how others act, and focusing on mutual benefit, not just maximizing your own gain in the short term.
A powerful message. Even in a world driven by self-interest, cooperation can actually be a logical outcome, even an evolutionarily stable one.
It can.
So for you listening, here's something to think about. Look at the interactions in your own life, personal, professional, how you engage with your community. Where do you see those prisoners' dilemma dynamics happening? And how could these principles we've talked about help you create more cooperative, mutually beneficial outcomes? Think about what specifically in your life helps or hinders cooperation.
And if this deep dive has gotten you curious, we highly recommend checking out The Evolution of Cooperation by Robert Axelrod. It's a much deeper exploration of these ideas.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.